thanks everybody. My name is Kate Rogers and I'm the Assistant Secretary of the Development Policy and Education team at Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. I have the privilege of having the Disability Inclusion team in my branch. So that's why I've been asked to chair this session today. So I'm very, very happy to be here, and I hear that so far, and I'm sure it will continue to be the case, that the conference has gone very well. So that's great news. So I'm chairing the disability panel, as I said. I hear that we have a very strict timetable, so I'm going to force us to adhere to that. So that means we've got an hour, we've got 2 topics. Each will be presented in 20 minutes. And then we'll ensure that we have 20 minutes for Q&A at the end. So without further ado, our first speaker this afternoon is Dina Afrianty. And now Dr. Afrianty is a research fellow at La Trobe Law School at La Trobe University. Her research focuses on women's rights in Muslim countries, looking at it from the intersection of law, religion and politics. And we were just talking before, and I was saying in my field of international development, intersectionality is becoming much more prominent. So she's sort of certainly specialising in something that's very topical. Dina is the founder of the Australia-Indonesia Disability Research and Advocacy Network. She earned her PhD from the University of Melbourne in 2011 and is the author of Women and Sharia Law in Northern Indonesia, Local Women's NGOs and the Reform of Islamic Law in Aceh, which was published by Routledge in 2015. So today, now if I can just find your topic, you are talking about changing laws? No, the other one. Sorry, that's very good preparation, isn't it? Where are we? Oh yes, here we go. On the back, oh yeah, here we go. Faith-based responses to disability, how public institutions are leading rights-based education reform in Indonesia. So if I can hand over.
Thank you, Kate, for the introduction. Thank you also, Pak Greg and Ibu Ronit, for the opportunity and inviting me to speak at this Indonesia update. And especially also thank you for dedicating a panel on disability inclusion in this Indonesia update. It is an honor for me to share here my research on disability inclusion in Indonesia that I have been doing since 2014. So let me start with this photo. This is a photo from the Araniri State Islamic University, located in Banda Aceh. At the center of this picture is a young Acehnese man who is visually impaired, and he's doing his entrance exam. And you can see everyone is looking at him. I was told that this is the first time ever that UIN Araniri in Banda Aceh has received the application from students with disabilities to study at the campus. This year also, UIN Araniri pledges itself to call itself a campus inclusive. As you can see also in this photo. And they printed it out on its university advertisement this year. And it also proudly called itself as Kampus Benteng Penegakan Syariat Islam. Anyway, Indonesia's National Survey 2012 estimates about 12.5% of the population have various forms of disability. As an important minority group, persons with disabilities are marginalized and meet widespread discrimination in their everyday lives. This marginalization makes disability invisible, hardly seen in public schools and universities, working in offices or engaged in various public activities alongside their able-bodied peers. The survey also indicates that there are more people with disabilities who live in rural places than in urban areas, and the prevalence of disability among women tends to be higher than in men. The level of participation of persons with disabilities in education become lower the further up the level of education we look. And only 37.8% of people with disabilities aged over 10 years old are employed or working, and majority of them work in agricultural sector. Their invisibility is a result of lack of understanding of their rights. They have been denied education, employment, health services, and broader socio-legal and political participation. This also leads to the difficulties in obtaining accurate data. Indonesian Muslims who have physical disabilities hardly ever pray in mosques and engage in religious activities. Likewise, the government and civil society do not realize they have obligation to provide access for persons with disabilities. The ratification by Indonesia of UNCRPD and the introduction of disability rights law that Professor Timlinson mentioned before are key milestones. These instruments require the Indonesian government and community to enable full participation of persons with disability, to enable persons with disabilities to reach their full capabilities on par with their non-disabled counterparts, and to make their own life choices and become independent person, and also to make disability ordinary. However, in a society with discrimination and exclusion so deeply entrenched, I thought it is important to understand public views towards disability. We need to appreciate how entrenched public attitudes are or can be a major barrier to inclusive policies. My presentation will focus mainly on how Islamic education institutions practice inclusion and are starting to systematically stimulate participation for persons with disabilities. But before that, I will share some stories with you that show the difficulties and challenges in confronting public views about disability and in the everyday life of persons with disabilities, and how such views can be influenced by religious thought. And the next part of my presentation, I hope, will be interesting for you. So in a conference that I organized last year in Jakarta, there is a PhD student from Gajah Mada University who conducted research looking at how Muslim communities in Yogyakarta and the surrounding of Central Java perceive disability. From this research, he found books that are widely used in the pesantren community that link disability with sexual activities. One of the kitab, Kurat al-Uyun, a book which explains that certain conjugal activities must be avoided by Muslim couples for their offspring to be born without disabilities. Those activities include sex while the wife is on her period, marrying relatives or incest, kissing the wife's two eyes when having sex, talking during sex, performing sex during certain times, such as in the night of the Eid Adha, on the first date, mid-month, and the last date of the month, looking at and touching the genitals, and failing to proceed sexual intercourse with foreplay. Although there were questions during his presentation, so what does Islam say, or what does the book say about foreplay? Because it seems like everything it says is about foreplay. But Maula couldn't really answer that. So it is said that failure to follow this guideline will lead to offspring to be born with several types of disabilities, including deafness, blindness, leprosy, and various other types of physical disabilities, and as well as mental illness. He also explained that those who learn about this book believe that disability is a punishment from God for the parents' wrongdoings. Other research in East Java and Makassar that I also conducted from 2015 to 2017 show similar results, that some elements within the Muslim community largely see disability as a sin or as a punishment, and therefore an embarrassment and a burden to the family and to the community. In the city of Makassar, when I was there in 2015, for example, a famous local preacher said in one of his sermons that leprosy, which is quite prevalent in the province, is a sin, and that it is a punishment from God because the parents might did something wrong during their sexual activities. So there is also perception among Muslims that sees disability as a blessing. Disability is received as an example of the need for Muslim families who have children with disabilities to be accepting, and that it is part of difficulties in life, And if responded with full submission to the will of Allah, it becomes a test of faith, and those who succeed will be granted rewards. But this understanding, too, is seen to contribute to that charitable response and a paternalistic view that devalues and discourages self-motivations among individuals with disabilities. By saying this, I don't mean to say that Islamic culture is the cause of exclusion of persons with disabilities in Indonesia, because actually scholars working in this field found that similar attitudes towards disability can also be found in other cultures. For me, seeing disability either as a sin or as a blessing requires the need to appreciate the readiness to accept that faith-based thinking can sit behind social exclusion. Both result in the exclusion of persons with disabilities from equal participation, including treating persons with disabilities as a subject of charity. So my response to this is to consider ways to counter this kind of approach by also exploit the same sentiment which adopts religious thought as a source of inspiration, but this time to serve as a positive influence. My position is therefore that as a major source of both political and spiritual inspiration for social change, this focus on the intersection of faith-based cultural views and social practices might ultimately contribute to a dialogue around faith as a source of inclusive and pluralist beliefs and practices more broadly. I think from this morning we have heard a lot of speakers mention about how religion becoming more becoming entrenched in Indonesian public life. So it is for this reason that in my research I look at Islamic education institution, also because I was based at Islamic University before I moved to Australia, which constitute 30% of Indonesia's education sector, and most of them are in rural Indonesia. Unlike the public education sector, they are regulated by the Ministry of Religion. It is widely accepted that the Islamic education sector is considered second class. It was for a long time marginalized, resulting in unequal support from government, which affected the quality of teaching, learnings, and services that they have provided to their students. It was only in the reform era that the quality of Islamic education gradually improved with more support from government as part of wider education systems, and also with a lot of work from DFED that Pak Robert and I worked before in the past. So in 2004, the National Ministry of Education introduced a decree on special education in tertiary education institution. Following the ratification of UNCRPD and also the introduction of disability rights law, the rights to access the tertiary education is regulated through the government regulation. It requires all tertiary education to implement special education for students who experience physical immobility, emotional, mental, social, or those with special needs and talents. But however, a report published by the Ministry of Higher Education in 2017 shows that of the total 4,600 universities within the ministry, only 152 of them reported having students with disabilities. And with a total of over 6 million students, only 401 are disabled students. This confirms the anecdotal evidence that suggests inadequate policies and facilities, particularly at university level, prevents full participation in all levels education. Data is very difficult to get when I try to get the information from the Ministry of Religion of how many students with disabilities are enrolled in Islamic Universities network. Prior to 2015, however, there have been reports in the media where Islamic State universities in Jakarta, Bandung, and Makassar rejected the enrollment of students with disability. Most of them are students with visual impairment who wanted to study at the Faculty of Tarbiyah or Education. The reason provided by this institution is that to be a teacher, one cannot be blind. So in May 2015, when I organized the first international conference on disability inclusion within the Ministry of Religion, Professor Amsal Bahtiar acknowledged, who is the Director General of Higher Education, acknowledged that there are yet to introduce any regulation on the provision of spatial and inclusive education at primary, secondary, and tertiary institutions. He also admitted that there have been no spatial madrasa, that there are equivalent of spatial schools like those in the public education system within the Islamic education sector. There has also been no inclusive education or spatial education curriculum within the Islamic education sector. However, the ministry said at that time that they started to develop on inclusive madrasa and pesantren after signing a memorandum of understanding with the Australian government in 2015. So thank you to Indonesia's closest neighbor. So now I would like to say some positive examples after some very depressing stories that show some improving access to people with disabilities across the State Islamic University sector. So in 2006, Professor Amin Abdullah, I know some of you very familiar with him, a well-known progressive Muslim scholar from UAN Sunan Kalijaga in Yogyakarta, instructed during a major campus renovation that he wants all buildings to be accessible. As a result, UAN Sunan Kalijaga is now considered one among the State Islamic University network that has accessible university library, mosque, classroom, cafeteria, and other public space. They also held an inclusive Friday prayer, providing signer during the sermon. So the commitment of State Islamic University in Yogyakarta did not stop there. It also established a Center for Disability Services. So it didn't get any support from the Ministry of Religion. So the rector initiative was to fund the center by the UIN own funding. So therefore, it is not surprising that when the Ministry of Religion attended the conference that I organized, he was surprised that actually UIN Sunan Kalijaga is an inclusive campus and that their building is accessible. In 2015, 55 disabled students were enrolled and studying at different faculties at UIN Yogyakarta. To support its disabled students, the center provides equipment, assisted devices in classrooms, trained academics and staff on inclusive education. But of course, there are some lecturers who refuse to have students with disabilities to attend their classes. For me, it is actually interesting and surprising that it took several years for other state Islamic university under the Ministry of Religion to follow the step of UIN Sunan Kalijaga. Albeit being the largest state Islamic university, it was only in 2016 that UIN Jakarta started to allocate funding to support some of its academics in partnership with my previous home, the Australian Catholic University, to learn about disability inclusion and researching disability in Islam. It was also, and then it ended up in November 2017, they set up its own disability research center and also disability services. At almost the same time, UIN Araniri in Banda Aceh also established disability research center. This initiative arose from a brief discussion about disability in Islam as part of a workshop that I held with several academics from different faculties about disability, Islam, and social policy in Aceh. It is interesting that some of the academics who attended the workshop said that their knowledge about disability is only about their disabled neighbors who are kept inside their houses by their families. They said they have never seen students with disabilities sit in their classes or around the campus. This is an interesting story. One male academic from the Faculty of Da'wah, or Islamic Preaching, said, "Now I feel bad. I have never talked about what our religion says on disability in my sermons," which triggered further comment from a female academic. "That is because you have put so much emphasis on women's bodies. Now it's time for you to start talking about disability in Islam." So the case of Aceh for me is always interesting because the prevalence of disability in the province is quite high. Conflict and tsunami are believed to be behind the large number of people with disabilities. But interestingly, the two prominent universities in Banda Aceh claim to have no students with disabilities studying in their institution, despite that 250 students were graduated from special senior high school in the province. This shows that following a national trend, the average years of education for children with disabilities is short. Although both UAN Araniri and Siah Kuala campuses were built following the tsunami, none of the facilities was constructed as accessible. This problem of accessibility, according to the rector of UAN Araniri, is because they have never had any student with disabilities. He said, if we have someone who become crippled, either students or our staff or our academics member and needs special access, then we will build it. He also said, since there has been no demand for access, then the university does not have obligation. But he said the university is ready to accommodate once they are asked for that. So this is what he built. So from what I have discussed, it looks like Islamic education institution is slowly embracing inclusion. Two Muslim-based organizations, Muhammadiyah and Nahdlatul Ulama, have also made disability inclusion part of their national strategy, seeking to play a wider role in promoting the rights of persons with disabilities. And also, I think 2 weeks ago, Muhammadiyah board signed an MOU with one of the 8 programs funded by DFED to promote inclusive education in all Muhammadiyah schools from primary to secondary and to university, hopefully in the future. So for me, policy reform within the Islamic higher education could lead not only to the inclusion of persons with disabilities in tertiary education, but to have able-bodied students engage with their disabled peers in university, and this will have wider impact on social inclusion. I believe that social inclusion is a fundamental equity issue, and university is one of the sites where every individual can develop a sense of belonging and membership as they feel bonded with each other, and in the end creates a sense of acceptance of difference. However, as also seen elsewhere, religious institutions in Indonesia have played very minimal roles in promoting social inclusion and in addressing social stigma towards persons with disabilities. Islamic education institutions could play a more significant role in this area. The lack of inclusion within the Ministry of Religion is not only from neglecting the rights of every individual to equality education, but sadly, because it has not considered the importance of the role of religion to the life of the disabled person. I finish my presentation here. Thank you.
That was one of the best timed talks I've ever witnessed. To the second, Dina, well done. Look, I think what we heard there, I think, is not an unfamiliar story to those of us who work with disability. This cycle of poor data, invisibility, leading to or being used as an excuse for a lack of demand, and then inaction. But that was a very clear presentation, and obviously, you know, they're really relevant issues for the sector. So now I have the pleasure of introducing 2 speakers, and I'll get it right this time. I had a 50-50 chance last time. This time, so I'm going to introduce the topic first, and then I'll introduce the speakers, because this is really a co-presentation. So there'll be some interaction. So the topic will be changing laws, changing attitudes, and the place of people with disability in Indonesia. Each of the speakers will talk for 10 minutes. First, may I introduce Thushara Dibley. Thushara is the Deputy Director of the Sydney Southeast Asia Centre. She researches social movements in Southeast Asia with a particular focus on Indonesia and Timor-Leste. She's the author of Partnerships, Power and Peacebuilding, NGOs as Agents of Peace in Aceh and Timor-Leste, 2014. And then may I introduce Antoni Tsaputra. Antoni is a PhD candidate at the School of Social Sciences at the University of New South Wales in Sydney. His dissertation focuses on exploring the potential of disability-inclusive budgeting as a tool of disability-inclusive development for realising the rights of persons with disability in Indonesia. Antoni has also managed a series of international donor-funded disability community research grants implemented by PPDI Kota Padang, that's a local disabled persons organisation, in collaboration with other NGOs and DPOs in the province. I should have asked what province. Oh, in Sumatra. Okay, there we go. That was a vital piece of information that was lacking from my description. I'm going to hand over to Antoni first. Oh no, sorry, beg your pardon, to Thushara first, and we'll have 20 minutes. Thank you.
Thanks, Kate, and I'll echo Dina's thanks to Greg and Ronit for inviting Antoni and I to speak, and for including a disability panel in the update. It's great that the issue is getting so much attention. This is Dewi. Dewi was born in Jambi in the 1980s with physical disability. She was also born to a family who did not prescribe to the mainstream way of thinking about disability prevalent at that time. Rather than being hidden away in her home, she was actively encouraged to participate in her family and community life. She was expected to complete the same household chores as her siblings and expected to complete her education. Now she is the leader of the local Jambi branch of the Indonesian Association for Women with Disability, and recently she's even travelled to Australia for leadership training in recognition of her leadership potential. So what does Dewi's story have to do with the implementation of the National Disability Law, which is the focus of our presentation today? So for decades, Indonesian disability activists have been pushing for changes that would bring about, legislation that would bring about structural changes that make it possible for all people with disability in Indonesia to live full and independent lives like Dewi. They've had reasonable success, as Tim has sort of pointed out, in convincing policymakers to pass laws that embody these principles. But as we will demonstrate today, when it's come to the implementation of these laws, they've encountered a little bit more resistance. Our argument is that this is due in part to a lack of understanding on the part of policymakers about the principles underlying the law and what it would look like for these principles to be enacted in practice in the Indonesian context. But it's also due to the fact that disability, unlike many of the other issues that we're discussing over the next couple of days, is not a politically contentious issue in the Indonesian context. Policymakers can cut corners when it comes to disability and are unlikely to face significant political ramifications. So over the next 18 minutes, what we'll do in our presentation is start with a brief overview of the disability context in Indonesia, so building on some of the facts and figures that Dina has already shared with us, before talking about two elements of the implementation of the law. So earlier Tim mentioned that the National Disability Commission is a key part of the law, but that nothing has happened yet. We've decided to focus on two areas where there has been a little bit of progress. So we'll first outline the negotiations related to the implementing regulations associated with the law, and second we'll discuss what's been happening with the disability card, which has been identified in the national law as something that needs to happen. The developments around both these aspects demonstrate the difficulty that disability activists have had in Indonesia in convincing policymakers to make the conceptual shift away from thinking about disability as a welfare issue to thinking about it as a rights issue. We'll conclude with a brief overview of what's happening what the impact of this national law is beyond Jakarta.
The global disability movement has a great influence on disability activism in Indonesia. So the global shift towards the social model of disability, in which there was a greater scope to think about people with disability as individuals with rights that need to be fulfilled, rather than as individuals with problems who need to be helped. The growing popularity of the social model of disability, the idea that disability is a consequence of social structures and infrastructure that cannot accommodate people unless they are able-bodied, was reflected in the push towards a new term, driven primarily by activists from Central Java. These activists made a case for using the word difable, so derived from the English word differently abled. So the term difable was meant to move away from the negative connotations of other terms used and reflect, and this term reflects the range of capabilities that people living with disability possess. This term became increasingly popular among activists in Yogyakarta and other parts of Central Java, but did not take hold to the same extent within the network of disability advocates and policymakers based in Jakarta. For many decades, particularly before the United Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability ratification, disabled people in Indonesia were labeled in the government policies with various terms that mostly portray them as deficient. For example, the word cacat or defect reflected a social belief that those with disabilities were worth less as humans, or orang yang dalam kekurangan jasmani atau rohani, that emphasized disabled people's physical or mental deficit. And euphemistic terms were also used to describe disabilities, such as the use of the prefix tuna, which are still commonly used at this time. Like, for example, like tuna netra for blind, or tunarungu, or actually the deaf community would prefer the term tuli, but the one used in the policy is tunarungu, which means deaf people. Tuna actually means deficit. The official terminology change to address disability terminology happened when the Indonesian government ratified the Disability Convention, or the UNCRPD, through Law Number 19 of 2011. So the term used in this law was penyandang disabilitas, derived from the English term person with disability. So despite the change in the terminology, the challenges related to disability issues in Indonesia haven't changed much before and after the ratification of the UNCRPD. The challenges faced by people with disabilities still revolve around difficulties in enjoying basic human rights such as education, employment, and participation due to prevailing stereotypes, social stigmatization, and the lack of accessible infrastructure. Data inconsistency also remains the greatest challenge for disability policy in Indonesia. Next slide, please. Such persisting challenges and the UNCRPD ratification have been the reason for disability activists to push for changes to Indonesia's legislative framework. They demanded a new rights-based disability law to replace the former welfare-focused law number 4 of 1997. Indonesia signed the convention in 2007 and ratified it in 2011. As a signatory to the convention, the government of Indonesia was then in a position where it had to adjust its policies related to disability, many of which directly contradicted the central tenets of the CRPD. So this became the basis for an extended campaign for a new national disability law, driven primarily by disability activists based in Jakarta. So a network called the Working Group on Disability Law, or the Kelompok Kerja Undang-Undang Disabilitas, or more commonly referred to as POKJA, was instrumental in driving the campaign for this law. So members of POKJA worked with the National Human Rights Commission, or Komnas HAM, to develop a draft law based on the CRPD. And supported by activists around the country, the campaign lasted 4 years and led to the passing of a new national disability law, which is Law Number 8 of 2016, concerning people with disability, in May 2016. The new disability law expected to change the way the Indonesian government approaches disability from a welfare focus only within the domain of Ministry of Social Affairs to a rights approach that makes disability a multi-sectoral issue under different relevant ministries.
So, to what extent has the presence of this new law, passed 2 years ago, led to disability becoming treated as a multi-sectoral issue? In short, things have not progressed as activists had hoped. For the Pokja activists, so that working group who worked on drafting the law, their photos are on this slide, one of the key things that differentiated the new law from the previous disability law was that it required a much broader suite of ministries to be involved in addressing disability issues. Until the passing of the 2016 law, the Ministry of Social Affairs was the key ministry involved in disability issues, and it was involved primarily through the distribution of welfare payments and through coordinating rehabilitation programs. For activists, under the new law, it was critical that other ministries were involved, because the kinds of changes they envisaged that the law would lead to, for example, in the education system, to the justice sector, and to infrastructure, required the involvement of more than just the Ministry of Social Affairs. Now, the activists' expectations were not realized in the final wording of the law, where the only ministry that was named was the Ministry of Social Affairs. They responded to this by doing a close analysis of the final draft and identifying 7 different ministries that could potentially have responsibility for implementation. And they identified 18 implementing regulations, 15 government regulations, 2 presidential regulations, and 1 ministerial regulation. So for those of you a little bit less familiar with the lawmaking process in Indonesia, for a law to take effect, it needs implementing regulations which spell out how the law is going to be put into place. It's usually affiliated with a particular ministry, and this has implications for how it is funded. So 1 year after the law was passed, no action had been taken by the government to enact any of these 15 regulations. The only ministry that had incorporated any of the activities related to the law in their budget was the Ministry of Social Affairs. So, in July 2017, the government announced that it would issue just 1 government regulation, not the 15 that the activists hoped, and that regulation would be the responsibility of the Ministry of Social Affairs. Government officials argue that this was in line with Jokowi's sort of deregulation policy, sort of trying to streamline the number of policies implementing regulations being released, that it was due to budgeting issues in the other ministries identified as potentially being able to play a role, and that having 1 implementing regulation would mean the law would be implemented faster. As you can imagine, the Pokja activists were not at all happy with this announcement, as it effectively would mean that yet again the Ministry of Social Affairs was the primary ministry responsible for disability. First, activists did not believe that ministry could realistically oversee changes that were in the domain of other ministries. And second, symbolically, it would mean that disability would continue to be seen by the government and by the community more broadly as a welfare issue. So they communicated their dissatisfaction through a series of blog posts, a press conference, and reached out to personal contacts within government departments, and these actions had some success. An individual within the Ministry of Development Planning, or Bappenas, took a personal interest and lobbied the other ministries, leading to the drafting of 8 government regulations, so down from 15, involving 7 different ministries. In early 2018, activists felt optimistic that this intervention by Bappenas would have a positive impact, but by May 2018, activists were disappointed again when the government issued just 4 of these government regulations, 2 of which were affiliated to the Ministry of Social Affairs. So what is the significance of this back and forth around the implementing regulations? Despite the efforts of activists to push the government to broaden its view of who is responsible for addressing the needs of people with disability, it's clear that through this struggle, that the links between disability and welfare remain strong within the minds of Indonesian policymakers.
An example of challenging implementation of the new disability law that also is related to the remaining social welfare focus can be seen in the disability card mandated by Article 22 of the new disability law. The national disability law itself provides very limited information about disability card and how it is to be implemented. Beyond stating that the card is to be linked to a national data collection process, the law provided no further details. The implementing regulation for this mandate is the Ministerial Regulation of Social Affairs number 21 about the production of disability cards, which was released in November 2017. The release of this ministerial regulation was met by criticism and the demands for revision from the Pokja activists due to inconsistency in the regulation that pose difficulties for people with disability to access the card. And the concept of disability card itself has been a source of controversy among disability activists. The key point of contention relates to whether the card is a form of discrimination or a pathway for accessing resources that can potentially empower people with disability. While neither the law nor the ministerial regulation indicate that the card would be linked to the provision of welfare benefits, some disability activists believe that this should be an important element of the card. Next slide, please. And the situation has been made more complicated by the introduction of other forms of disability cards by both the Ministry of Social Affairs and district governments. So for example, in 2016, the former Indonesian Minister of Social Affairs introduced and launched a disability inclusive card related to its conditional cash transfer scheme, the Family Hope Program or Program Keluarga Harapan or the PKH. And at the launch, the minister claimed that disability inclusive PKH card was being introduced as part of the implementation of the new disability law. But actually, the PKH card, in fact, had no links to the national disability law. It was conceived even before the national disability law was drafted. And interestingly, the local governments at the district level, they have interest in also developing their own version of disability card, whether, even though there is no stipulation in the law or in the ministerial regulation that they have to develop that kind of card, but I think that such a decision implies that there is something appealing to policymakers about development of such a card, because card policy is really popular right now.
Okay, so we've talked about changes at the national level. I will just briefly go through sort of 3 key points about what's happening beyond Jakarta. So for the national law to be fully implemented, provincial governments need to issue their own provincial regulations. In some provinces, this has happened already. Activists pushed for this to happen. But for those activists that did it before the national law was passed, now these provincial regulations need to be aligned with the national law. But in other provinces, activists report that local leaders have no idea even that a national law was passed. So in these places, there's a lot of work to be done. But activists have reported that the presence of a law acts as a weapon for advocacy to push local leaders to put these regulations into place. The difficulty here, though, is that not all activists across the country have the capacity or the resources to campaign to their local leaders, which poses the risk that the implementation of the law across the country will be patchy and ununiform. So just to wrap it up, I think it's fair to say that the implementation of the national disability law has been slow, but this is unsurprising in the Indonesian context, where, as Tim and Simon have already indicated, it's common for laws to be passed, but to take a long time to be implemented, if at all. This is particularly the case for a law like the disability law, where policymakers are being pushed to challenge the status quo. As we've demonstrated, this concept, this welfare approach has remained. We've seen that in the struggle around the implementation regulations and also in some of the issues related to the disability card. This is in part due to a lack of awareness of policymakers who have not been involved in the same debates and discussions about disability at the international level. During the process of drafting the law, this lack of awareness was a benefit to activists who are able to push these ideas to be included in the law. But this same lack of awareness has now become an impediment to the implementation. But more critically, it's the lack of awareness of the general population as a whole about disability that means that there's little incentive on the part of the government to take risks related to implementing disability policy. As I mentioned before, there will be few political consequences for politicians for not implementing the law as it has been written. Added to that, the fact that local governments are also required to pass local regulations in order for the law to be fully realized means that the full implementation of the law relies on the skills and capacity of local activists, as well as the commitment of local leaders to seeing this law being put into place. So then what does this mean for the place of people with disability in Indonesia? Indonesia has made some significant steps in a positive direction in terms of embracing international norms around disability in its legislation. But the implementation process demonstrates that the rights and needs of people with disabilities still sit quite low on the priority list. Activists have worked very hard to get Indonesia to the place that it is now, but it's clear that their struggle is likely to continue for some time into the future. Thank you.
another fabulously timed presentation. Thank you very much, Sarah and Antoni. I mean, I think what that presentation really did, of course, was hone in on the challenges involved in moving away from the social welfare-based approach to a human rights-based approach in relation to disability. Also, for me, really brought home the importance of disabled people's organisations keeping up that advocacy work, but also, you know, the need that activism by those DPOs is not in and of itself enough, that with 1 in 7 people globally living with a disability, there should be a pool of other people ready to jump in and advocate as well. And it's really sort of making those connections, I think, that is really critical. We're going to go to questions now. The time is, we've got about 15 minutes for questions, so I'm going to take them in groups of 2. And just ask that you nominate which speaker you would like to address the question to, and don't go for the long lists of questions, please. I'll cut you off. Okay, so, all right, we've got one over here on my right.
Sydney Jones again. I was curious as to whether you as advocates can use the Para-Asian Games as a focal point, because you think of the nationalist upsurge in pride that the Asian Games brought, you would think that holding the Para Games might be a vehicle for getting this issue front and center. So I'd just be curious as to what you're planning. Thanks.
Okay, that's one. Any more? Okay, we've got one right in the middle here. If we can get the microphone from my left to the middle. Okay, thank you.
Hello, my name is Gabrielle Natalia. I'm a student of Bachelor of International Relations. I'm aware that in Indonesia, subject of mental disability is often regarded as taboo or sensitive. And I also observed that there are very few facilities that could accommodate students or people of mental disability. So my question is open for all speakers. So what are the existing efforts and policies to create a more inclusive society on people of mental disability? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We might go to answers to those two. The first question?
Yeah, in regards to the effect of the decision to hold the Asian Games and the Para Games, and I would like to say I'm very grateful that Asian Games was held in Indonesia, because it gave a very a big change. I mean, like especially when it comes to the Para Games. We can see like some changes, especially when it comes to the infrastructural accessibility, especially in the Gelora Bung Karno. Because of these Asian Games and the Para Games now, it is really accessible. They provided any like disabled toilet and then spatial space for people in wheelchairs. Yeah, I don't think that would happen without Asian Games. Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's a great impact. And another thing, I think there is a good change also, for example, for people who had no knowledge at all about disability. For example, the Indonesian Committee for Asian Paralympic Games, they would like to intensively communicate with disability activists. Even they accommodated people with disability to be part of the volunteers in organizing the Asian Games as well as the Paralympic Games. So there is, I think there's a very good change in the willingness to learn about more about disability from disability activists. Yeah.
Okay. Was there any other comments on that particular question? No? Or we can go to the next one.
I think I probably just add to that first. That's also very interesting because there is now more open and public debate over what disability is. For example, during the preparation, some, the words like inspirasi dari atlet disabilitas, and which is for activists and for disabled activists, it's like porn inspiration. You don't say it because, but then now it becomes viral and people are talking about it, and those who don't understand about why we cannot say that people with disabilities inspire us, and they get to engage with those kind of conversation, and it is, so it's kind of good. And when they created this song, and where it's only Indonesian artists who sing it without including anyone who is disabled, so it also become a critique from disabled activists, like, why are you not including us? And then they realized, okay, yeah, we missed that, and then so it's in a way it's a very good opportunity so that people engage in the discussion. And about the mental disabilities, maybe if I can just start on that. I think most of you probably see the recent documentary on SBS about cycling practices in Indonesia. Actually, the Indonesian government banned the practice since 1977, but largely people, especially in the rural areas, still practice that. And one of the presenters at the conference last year in Jakarta mentioned that actually the Indonesian government in Yogyakarta, the local health services already provided services, but the problem is with the families. Some of them still think that cycling is the best way to sort of like heal their members, the members of the family who are having mental disabilities, rather than trying to get professional healthcare services. So that's why there are some places in around Yogyakarta, for example, that provide this kind of services. Not like services, like because parents, families, they just put their family member and then believe that that's the best way to cure and then to take away the gene or whatever they believe to be getting into the spirit that get into the body of their family members. So yeah, so we are, I think the issue is really about how people understand disabilities, and especially mental disabilities in this case. And also the government needs to really promote and talk more about mental disabilities and the services that they have.
Yeah, if I can add a little bit on what Dina just said. I'm talking about the inclusion of people with mental disability itself within the Indonesian disability activism. And it was not until like a few years back that people with mental disability was acknowledged by disability activism in Indonesia. So we already have like one national umbrella organization for people with mental disability in Indonesia. And this organization has done a lot of amazing work in advocating for the inclusion of the needs of people with mental disability within the JKN, so National Health Insurance. So the needs of mentally disabled people, especially when it comes to expensive medicines, were covered in that JKN scheme. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. We might go to another couple of questions now. Okay. Here on my left with the purple, and we might identify the next question as well, just to save a bit of time. There was someone else over this side that had their hand up, I think. Okay, so we'll go from here and then down 4 rows, I think, after this question. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Eliza Hunt. I'm from the Centre for Mental Health Research here at the ANU. Working in mental health research and advocacy in Indonesia, also I'd just like to pick up from the previous question that, we go by the slogan, there is no health without mental health. So in terms of the definition of disability, I think that is an actual issue at the moment in terms of in academia, in research, but also in policy. And I see panels all the time and policy policy interventions and all sorts of things that do cleave physical and mental disability and separate them out. And I think that's wrong, because I think that basically, I think we're taking from the Western kind of Cartesian subject of basically mind-body duality. And the reality is that individuals are dealing with similar disadvantages and similar obstacles in terms of their difficulties. And I think some of the human rights abuses that when you've got doubly disadvantaged populations that are suffering from mental illness, they might be suffering also from physical disabilities, that you're finding them more and more lumped into those group of orang telantar, so those left behind. So we're seeing lots of people from those sort of, from the social welfare organisations and those sorts of things to pick them up. So I'm wondering, in terms of what we're seeing in the mental health field, is a real hollowness from at the level of, from the legal framework coming from the 2014 legislation for the rights-based stuff for the mentally ill. And we're seeing a hollowness of all those sorts of things that are mentioned in terms of building up those interventions in the field. They simply mostly don't exist. And I think you might be saying a similar thing. And I'm wondering, in terms of the funding that's actually put to some of these programs, because we're finding we've got 1% of the 3% of the health of that is, you know, the 3% of the whole budget is the health budget, and we've got 1% of that for mental health. I'm wondering, in terms of what sort of finances are sort of available for some of these interventions, because I know the things that are happening in mental health are moving very slowly because of the restrictions in funding. Thank you.
Okay. And we'll take another question. So essentially, if I'm correct, your question was what's happening with the financing for mental health relative to other aspects of the disability agenda in Indonesia. Okay, thanks. And then down to the second question here, just the lady with the lovely necklace on.
Sinta Benilda from CIT. So my question is for any one of you. So I just would like to know, what was it like under Gus Dur? Gus Dur was our president, a former president who was disabled as well. He was half blind, or he was blind totally. So then, and then also the other question is about what will happen if we have a change of government in 2019. Do you have any idea what will happen about the disabled communities under Prabowo or under Jokowi in the future? Thank you.
Okay, thanks. And before the panel get out their crystal balls for that one, we'll only have time for one more question. So if anyone has a burning... Oh no, we don't actually have time for one more question. So that's those two questions. One on the financing, the second on, well, in fact, that's three questions, Gus Dur, and then looking ahead. Thanks.
Well, I don't actually know anything about the funding for mental health interventions, so I'm sorry, I can't comment on that one. Maybe I'll take on, with Gus Dur, what I do know is that a few disability activists have talked about how inspirational it was, even though I'm not supposed to use that word, for them to see someone with a disability in a leadership position. But in terms of the effect of the change of government, I mean, Antoni and Dina probably have more to say on this, but in the lead up to the last election, both Prabowo and Jokowi committed to making changes for people with disability. So, I mean, I suspect that it's one of those issues that it won't cost them a lot to make similar commitments into the future for either of them. So I suspect it would be the same. Things will most likely proceed as they have been.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm not really sure about the mental health financing for mentally disabled people. But to my knowledge, because I used to work for local Dina Social, and one of their division, like they help poor people with with disability to be institutionalized. So all the expenses in sending the mentally disabled person to this institution was covered by the government. I think that's the only thing I know about that. And I think during the Gus Dur's administration, we saw a very good, I would say, affirmative action. Probably you have ever heard about GAUN, Gerakan Aksesibilitas Umum Nasional, but it did not happen quite long. You know, I mean, like for example, like the train station in Jakarta before they had like accessibility, but then because lack of maintenance, and now it's like deteriorating, and then I don't know. Right now, such movement is not heard anymore. Okay. And I think for the 2019 election, it will depend again on the ability of disability activists to influence both of these candidates about their important issues.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, thank you. I think we'll have to wrap it up there. Can I ask everybody to please join together in thanking Thushara, Antoni and Dina. Thank you.